Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Katie, and we're so glad you're joining us for episode 2. Today, Evan and I are joined by Raghu, another member of our board, and we're breaking down the biggest news in the province right now. We're diving into the brand new Alberta provincial budget to see where our tax dollars are going, and we'll be discussing the upcoming October referendum on immigration and the Constitution. There's a lot to unpack, so let's dive right in. Okay, the Alberta government has introduced their budget for the 2026-2027 fiscal year, and it looks like this budget projects a $9.4 billion deficit, as well as increasing the provincially set education property tax. So how are you guys feeling about this budget? What are some of your main takeaways looking into this?
Well, for me, I think it's the government trying to make the best out of the circumstances we're in. Like currently, our oil revenues are down because price of oil has gone down internationally. And we have record population growth, which makes it like very difficult to manage like very important files. And we see that the government, is making record investments in healthcare and education. There's a lot of positive measures that they brought forward, right? We see that they want to add like 4,500 new teachers and educational assistants, spending $1.4 billion over 3 years for that. They're trying to build 160 schools in the next 3 years. They're adding modular classrooms, which is a plus point because it helps to add space quickly, right? Because we have a record number of students enrolling, so we need something that would that help to that would help to facilitate students' education, right? In the meantime, while we're building larger facilities like schools, and with healthcare, we also see that they're going to be spending like $34.4 billion this year. And they're going to be investing $1.9 billion to assist with wait times, physician services, mental health beds, and continuing care. They're going to be spending $525 million over 3 years to deliver 50,000 additional surgeries using the chartered surgical facilities that we already have to boost up the number of surgeries we're doing. And for families that don't have access to a family doctor, they're trying to expand the roles of nurse practitioners, but they're spending $87 million on that, which would just help to improve accessibility. And I think it's one of those budgets where there's fees and taxes that are going to be going up. For example, like a vehicle rental, they're going to be charging extra tax on that, and it's also going to be for like, data centers are going to be taxed just as measures to bring in revenue. I think right now there's also the situation going on in Iran right now, which could increase the oil prices and provide us with like much needed revenue to assist with our budget. So I don't think it's like there are some like tough pills to swallow in here, but I think it's necessary, right? And in the long term, we can find our way out of this situation.
I agree with how necessary it is to have our education healthcare spending increased. And I do think a lot of the spending that we are seeing from this budget is from promises that the government has given to unions. Like, I believe we're giving 22% raises to physicians. That's a lot. It's a lot of money for people who already do make a lot of money, but it is meant to keep us competitive. So in the long run, I see the benefit, and it hopefully will save us money in the long run, having a sustainable healthcare system that has a sustainable amount of physicians. I do have large concerns about the size of the deficit. I just think about it in terms of the Heritage Fund. We have the Heritage Fund, build it to $250 billion, and then the interest that we make off that Heritage Fund would help sustain our economy. But debt has the same effect. We have to pay interest on every dollar that we have in debt. And I believe that we are currently at $3.4 billion in interest payments a year. That figure could be wrong. It's what I found. And so I call it the Heritage Fund's evil sister because, we want to have a Heritage Fund that is giving us interest money. But it's hard to do that when we have a debt that is also costing us money. So I believe that there has to be a balance to building the Heritage Fund and also paying down our debt. And it's also concerning how reliant we are on the price of oil. The figure Danielle gave was for every $1 that goes down in oil prices, we lose $750 million from our budget. And that's not very sustainable when you have a resource that fluctuates in price so often. And so you hear Danielle say all the time that oil is the cornerstone of Alberta. But I think we need to remember that a shape has more than one corner, and we need to drastically start diversifying our industry to at least make it sustainable when oil prices fall. They will fall and will fall for many years. We're going to have years like this where it's just not going to work well for our budget. And so we need to have an industry and an economy that works for it. Furthermore, the tax increases is just a bad look for us. It's hard for us as volunteers and for members of the UCP to go out and tell everyone that we are the party of financial responsibility and low taxes when we are currently $9 billion more in debt and increasing taxes. So it's definitely a hard situation. But based off what I've seen the government investing in and with healthcare and education, I hope it saves us money down the road.
I think that this budget is a reminder of the precarious situation that the UCP and that conservatives hold when trying to create budgets and trying to balance how much do you fund social services that we need as people and how much do you maintain that fiscal responsibility that conservatives do desire. Because I think that it is easy to, as conservatives, to have this very instinctual reaction to debt as being a negative thing. And I think that also as a party and as conservatives, we always really champion this fact that we will, reduce deficits and have budgets that are not causing us to go into debt, because debt is not a good thing and debt is not a place that you want to be in. But at the same time, you'll always have your detractors on the left who are saying, why aren't you funding social programs more? Why aren't you supporting the people that live in your province? And it also just, there is this human empathy side of, you also want to, as conservatives, compassionate conservatives, you also do want to support these people and you want to make sure that the people of your province are being taken care of. And unfortunately, in an economy such as the one that we have currently, we don't have all the money to be able to respond to all these needs. And I think that, I really understand why the conservatives are a party that values not being in debt. But because this is a position that we have held ourselves to, it's easy for people both within the Conservative Party, but also on the side of the NDP to say, you guys said that we won't be in debt or you'll be limiting the debt, and then here you come out with a $9.4 billion deficit. And I think that it's just a reminder of the difficulty, because, the NDP, they don't say things like that they're going to limit the debt. And then they can go out and they can spend as much money as they want. And at least the people on their side won't be upset about it, because they never promised to not be in debt in the first place. But yeah, it's just a reminder of kind of that difficult position that conservatives have to try to find a balance between these two things. And in this article that I found from Discover Airdrie, it says that the Alberta's New Democrats also criticized this budget. And NDP leader Naheed Nenshi said that the UCP government has spent so much money to deliver so little for Albertans. After 7 years under the UCP, life is demonstrably harder for Albertans, and this budget doesn't help. And I thought that was a very interesting statement, and I wondered if you guys had any thoughts about that, if you think that there's validity to that statement made by the leader of the opposition, or if you think that this is kind of just, along partisan lines of they would have criticized the budget regardless. Because, it's hard after everything that happened with the teacher strike and with unions with healthcare as well, to think that, the NDP wouldn't be satisfied if we cut their funding, but they wouldn't be satisfied if we increase it either, because they're still going to be in a deficit. So I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts along those lines.
I think a lot of it comes down to like partisanship, right? Like obviously, they're not the ones in this situation having to deal with, such tough circumstances, and so they are gonna try to like pin blame on us, for how the budget's appearing right now. Well, the thing is, like, the they've been complaining that we're not spending enough and we're not investing enough, on healthcare and education. But now that we are these record investments, they're like they're coming back and saying, like the size of the deficit's too large. So it's like, which one is it, right? That's really the question here. We need to invest, right? It's not acceptable to just sit back and watch as our healthcare system and education system, continue to decline, right? We had to intervene, and if the NDP has complaints with that, then I feel like a lot of it just comes down to partisanship.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important to recognize that a lot of this big spending increases is still from the deals that we made from the unions, and it'd be an even worse look for us to just be like, okay, well, now we're not going to give you that money that we promised. So we do have to follow through with a lot of it, and that we're going to see a deficit from that. And I find it ironic that the NDP supported the teacher strike. They support all these unions, and now they're surprised when our spending goes up and our deficit is higher. You can't ask for more funding and a lower budget. That's not how that works. But it is our responsibility at the end of the day. We do have a UCP government, and so when we have a $9.4 billion deficit, it is our responsibility. Does that mean that the deficit was avoidable? No, it certainly wasn't. I think that there was going to be a deficit no matter how we played this year out. I think it's going to be pretty bad for all of Canada. We haven't gone much from the other provinces, but I believe BC is looking at a $13 billion deficit. So I think all around, it's going to be a pretty bad year for Canada. We are probably going to do a lot better, but a deficit is a deficit, no matter how large.
Also, just to build on that, actually, like Alberta has like the strongest fiscal position, of any province, like in this situation, right? So, like, yes, it is concerning, especially as conservatives, since we do promote, keeping keeping budgets balanced and deficit and debt, low. But relatively speaking, we're still doing much better off than other provinces. That's just an important thing to mention.
And I think building on that idea as well of like understanding why we're in this position in the first place, because I think to put all of that blame onto the UCP and even just, the government in Alberta in general is definitely inaccurate, because I think a lot of the strain on the province fiscally over the past couple of years has been population growth that is the result of federal immigration quotas. That's
Right.
actually just not even that's not the responsibility, and that's not something that the province, UCP or otherwise, has any control over, and yet that is what is putting such a strain on our province. And we're feeling that a lot in Alberta specifically because this is one of the most desirable places for people to immigrate to, because we do have a strong economy and we have job opportunities in industry that aren't available in other areas. So I think for Nenshi to say that this is the UCP's fault and that it's the UCP's fault that Albertans are struggling economically is inaccurate. It's not the result necessarily of legislation that the UCP has put forward, but of things that are happening federally. And I think, as we're discovering as Albertans, we don't have control over what is happening federally, even if we want to put our input in on what they're doing on a federal scale. We're not able to do that, which does kind of segue us into the referendum topic as well. But yes,
I
Raghu.
agree. Yeah, you just like took the words from my mouth. I was gonna say that that does like really touch on what we're gonna be talking about,
Mhm.
soon enough, like about like autonomy and everything.
Yes.
'Cause I
Yeah.
do think, look, we have to do what's in our control, right? And that's what the province is doing at the moment.
Do we have any final comments on this topic here?
I think it's best we move on to our next one.
So moving on, segueing nicely into our next topic. Alberta Premier Daniel Smith announces a fall referendum on immigration and constitutional questions. So Premier Smith wants to hold a referendum in October on measures to limit immigration to Alberta and changes she believes would give the province more rights under the Constitution. So what are some of the ideas that spring to your guys' mind on this topic of a referendum?
Should we start with the immigration section of the referendum? Okay, yeah, I think that would be, well, it's no doubt that the immigration that we have currently is unsustainable. As Danielle Smith said it in her own, while announcing the referendum, over the last 5 years, 600,000 people have migrated to Alberta. We don't have the job growth for that. We don't have, the housing for that. So we need to be able to have some sort of control over that, because when all these people are coming in and we don't have the infrastructure or the jobs to sustain them, it only makes their lives and our lives more difficult. Right? It makes housing more rare for both of us. It makes everything harder to do for everyone. And the student growth has been ridiculous. It was 80,000 students in 4 years. And that is why a lot of our schools, especially in more urban areas like Edmonton, Calgary, they have higher complexity and they have higher class sizes. And I wonder, I don't know if Kate, if you remember us looking at complexity being higher in Calgary and Edmonton, I wonder if that complexity is due to a lot of these students not speaking English as their first language. So I would figure that that would attribute to it greatly. And so for immigration, I do think we need more control as a province. It's very hard to do because we do have our Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees movement, so we can't really block people from moving in. But I guess that would be a conversation for the federal government and Danielle Smith to have.
Yeah, I do think that that something that I discussed with somebody who works. This is a person who works very closely with immigrants here into Edmonton and who has for a very long time. Kind of something that we were talking about last weekend when we were discussing this topic was that the money that we're spending to fund these large amounts of immigrants would be much better put towards supporting a small amount of immigrants and actually giving them support when they get into the country, having it so that they can actually be able to integrate themselves into our society so that they can speak English, so that they can understand how our culture works here, so that they can be successful and prosperous for themselves and for their country, so that it benefits them and makes their lives easier when they're here. Because I think that he was telling me that they get about a year of support once they come into the country, and then they're kind of just set out on their own, and that this year of support is not enough to help them actually integrate into our society. So I think that if the amount of immigrants is lowered, but the support and compassion that we can have towards them can be increased so that they'll be able to flourish while being here in Alberta, I think that that's something that is important. And I think that that would be a better use of our money so that we're not just seeing these people and these immigrants as workers who just come into our country and we'll use them so that they can contribute in our economy, but so that they can be people who contribute to our economy while being able to actually find success here and the ability to thrive. And so I think that initially that's really something that I thought when looking at the idea of what should we do with immigration here.
I agree with you guys, like on all the points you made. And this is like a lot of people in the opposition are acting like, you know, the government's like is just pushing this is just pushing this unilaterally, right? That like it's actually going to make the changes, but it's not what's happening, right? It's a referendum question for a reason, right? They are seeking people's approval and input before they do act, right? And and I definitely agree with that, right? It's best to give people a voice, especially since it concerns Albertans, since like the inflow of people into this province does concern us, right? It does, as you guys mentioned, like it affects our infrastructure, healthcare, education, and some of the other things that we've touched on. And another thing is like, the federal government, as you mentioned, they've they've kind of neglected like the status quo of merit-based immigration that's been happening under both liberal and conservative governments, allowing Alberta to kind of have its own immigration system where it could focus on merit, right? Bringing in people who are economic migrants that are going to be filling going to be filling positions that do that would help that would help to increase Alberta's productivity and economic growth. I think that's it's a great thing. And that's my opinion, right? Of course, this we're having a referendum for a reason, right? Like we may have our own opinion on this, but ultimately it's up to the people of Alberta. I agree with what the government's doing here with by giving people a choice to vote on it.
So I feel like we had a great talk on that. That seems very well-rounded. There's also two other bigger parts of the immigration section of the referendum, which is benefits for non-permanent residents and then voter ID, which is a very hot topic right now. So I want to go last on this one. So Katie, do you want to start on the benefits for non-permanent residents paying for benefits?
So this is definitely part of the announcement. When I was looking into it, this is the part that kind of like that hurt me a little bit. That I was like instinctually was like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that. And kind of the thing that I was thinking is I remember during COVID, and I feel like this is maybe not the best comparison, but follow with me on this and we'll see how we feel by the time I complete this thought. But remember during COVID, they were talking about limiting healthcare services to people who didn't get the vaccine because they were willingly putting a strain on the healthcare system. And this kind of made everybody discuss this topic of how do we limit healthcare to people, right? How do we decide who does and doesn't deserve healthcare? And I think healthcare it's an important thing. It's something that we all rely on, and it is often a matter of life and death. And I think it's difficult to say that permanent residents should have to pay premiums for healthcare. I understand the rationale, I do, because free healthcare is not free healthcare. It's paid for by taxpayer dollars. And so sometimes it can be difficult to justify people who aren't paying into that to partake in it, but I think that I think we see often how completely unaffordable healthcare is, and I just think I don't know if I really have an answer on this, but my instinctual reaction to the idea of paying a premium for healthcare is that doesn't leave me feeling good about that. But I'm not sure what the answer is because ultimately our healthcare system in Alberta is suffering. It is not working in an optimal way at all right now. And so we know that there is strain on it. And I think it comes back to this idea of the volume. The volume of immigrants, I think, is what is putting the strain on the healthcare system. It is not the fact that they are immigrants or the fact that they are permanent residents. So I think if we're able to resolve that volume issue of how many just people we have coming into the country, that I think by extension might solve and might like negate the necessity for having permanent residents pay a premium, but I'm not really sure how that might just be, wishful thinking.
I think there needs to be like more clarification around what these fees would look like, because I know like in the referendum question it's like from what the question like in its current formulation, like what it says is that it's so the one on fees, right? It's asking, assuming all citizens and permanent residents continue to qualify for public healthcare and education as they do now, do you support the government of Alberta charging a reasonable fee or premium to individuals with a non-permanent immigration status living in Alberta for their and their families' use of healthcare and education systems? Right. So as you can see, like I mean, it's not clear like what constitutes a reasonable fee, right? So I do think if like additional context was provided on that, it could really help people in informing their decisions on how they feel about this. Personally, like I am ambivalent on this one because I do think there needs to be more clarity, and that's why I mentioned like if they provided a bit more context behind this question, like context and rationale behind like what they would be proposing to do, then it would allow people to make like more informed decisions, including myself.
Yeah, I feel like it needs to be more specific because it's a very slippery slope to say a premium or a fee because reasonable is very subjective. Reasonable for one of us could be different from reasonable to someone else, and it could be hundreds of dollars. But I'm curious what it means by Alberta approved residents. That's what I'm curious about. So would people with student visas or work permits be Alberta approved? Who counts as Alberta approved, right? So that's the concern where I'm getting. And do we just choose? Like, who chooses who's Alberta approved? So I would like the government to go more in depth to this before I even think about voting on it, because I do agree that we need to take some strain off the healthcare system, but also most people, most non-permanent residents, like if you work in Alberta, you pay taxes. They are paying taxes in a way. So
Right.
it's hard to determine who's deserving. But again, that healthcare is kind of a human right for at least in a way. Healthcare is something everyone deserves. And it's just difficult to tell how the government will handle it if we give them permission. So they need to be more clear when they mention it.
Also, I think I misspoke when I was speaking. I meant to say non-permanent residents when I was saying permanent residents. So, a little clarification there. Sorry about that.
Should we move on to the proof of ID for voting?
Well, I agree with it. In order to vote, right, in provincial and federal elections, like you have to be a citizen. Just presenting proof of that is it's not that high. It's not that much of an obstacle for people, right, to undergo when they're going through the voting process, right? I mean, it is already pretty standard for us to show some proof, right, of like our residence, for example, in order to be able to vote. So I don't think this is much of a far stretch, like to have people present, just proof that they're citizens. It could certainly help to deter like possibilities of fraud. But yes, that's I agree with it.
I would like to start with the problems that a lot of people have with it. If we're going to understand the question, we have to understand why people have problems with it. And so I'm going to go with the Save America Act that the United States just passed. And a lot of criticism I've heard about it is that the qualifications for what counts as ID is very strict. And so it limits who's allowed to vote. Again, I haven't read the bill, so taking my word for it, look into it yourself. I'm not 100% sure. But I saw that birth certificates, which may count as valid, sometimes won't work because people change their name. Married people change their last name, so their birth certificate doesn't always line up with their current name. Sometimes we need to be careful what ID we count. Luckily for Alberta, though, we introduced new ID for our driver's license that indicate that we're citizens in the ID. I don't know if you guys seen that, but it's in the top right corner in our driver's license now. We should be having a CA that proves that we are citizens. So if we count that as ID, most people have driver's licenses. But then again, not everyone's able to have a driver's license too. Some people are, just unable to have access to certain ID. So we need to have systems in place that people who are citizens are able to get proper identification. Elections are for all citizens.
I'll admit I'm pretty ignorant on this topic, but the one thing I do know is that when I was working the federal election last spring, it was pretty broad what you could use as ID in order to vote. It wasn't limited just to like your passport or your driver's license. There were many different ways that you could present a valid ID that did confirm your identity. And I do think that in this day and age, it is important to confirm identity in order to vote. But I do think it is also important to make sure that elections are accessible. So I think, Evan, I agree. Like, I think that it's important that we make sure that people are able to vote and have access to proper ID that is available. And I think that it doesn't have to be limited just to one type of ID. But again, I don't know too much about this particular question and what it entails. So
That's the biggest concern, I would say, is as long as, because it is our right to vote. And so I trust you, if you say it's a pretty broad thing and we carry those rules and restrictions over to this legislation, I'm all for it. But as long as it's always, like I said, with a lot of these a lot of these bigger changes that are proposed in the referendum, we need to be careful, and there needs to be a lot of insight from a lot of people. We just can't afford to worsen our reputation by limiting who can and cannot vote.
But I guess a good point that Raghu did bring up is this is just a referendum, and it's just for the government to kind of gather where the Albertans are at, and then they will go from there and actually drafting legally permissible legislation as well. But yeah, I do think that it is important to remember that it is a referendum. It's not the answers from this referendum aren't legally binding. But yeah, it is good to have specificity as well in order so we can hold our government accountable. I do think that these questions about the constitutional amendments are very interesting because I think that this is something that I've heard people talk about for a very long time, wanting Alberta to be able to be more of a participant in what they want more autonomy from the federal government. And so I think that it's interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see these questions put forth. And the one thing that I noticed in an article that I was reading was that these amendments that the province is looking to pursue include abolishing the Senate. And I thought that this was very interesting because I remember when learning about the federal government in social class and learning about the Senate, I really thought, what a waste of money. What a waste of money and what a waste of effort. The senators are appointed by the federal government, by the prime minister, in order to represent province. Justin Trudeau was appointing senators to represent Alberta that did not align with Alberta's desires at all, and the provinces are grossly misrepresented. I don't remember exactly what the breakdown is, but I'm pretty sure Alberta has 3 or 4 senators when PEI has like 8 or something just absurd like that. And I just honestly, sometimes I think about it and I wonder how the Senate still exists in this. But of course, it's hard. It's hard to get rid of things that are very entrenched in a country's, in the way they function. So, but I did think that it was very interesting to think that the provinces would be able to pursue something like that because, I mean, currently Alberta can say all that they want about the Senate, but that doesn't really mean anything on a federal level. So I think pursuing the ability for a provincial perspective on that will be very important. And that was just the one that caught my attention when I was reading that article.
I think one of the challenges, of course, is like, and in theory, like from our perspective as Albertans, like it does sound good that you can abolish the Senate, but I'm just thinking about like the process. It's almost prohibitive to to amend the Constitution. Like there's a lot that goes into it, right? To amending the federal Constitution. There's like a 750 rule, right? You need approval of at least 7 provinces, and those provinces must represent at least 50% of Canada's population. And some of them, they require like you have approval from like House of Commons, Senate, and like all 10 provincial legislatures. This is just like a general overview that I'm giving. Like I'm not 100% familiar with the constitutional process, but like like figuring out how we're actually going to achieve that is another thing that it's a long process in and of itself. So it is good that this is being proposed to people, but I think it should like I think like the process of achieving these changes should also be clarified to people, right? Just so they have an understanding of it. I think another good thing about like having these at least proposing it in a referendum is that I think having more autonomy, like I don't think separation is a solution to like to our problems as Albertans, right? Perhaps having more autonomy could go a long way in addressing some of our key challenges. And so I really do like how there is kind of an emphasis on like at least putting forward some options for expanding our autonomy. That's one thing that I really like about these proposals and these referendum questions.
Yeah. Well, it is unfortunate that a lot of the constitutional changes part of the referendum are very hopeful in, you know, probably unlikely to ever do anything, even if the Albertan people approve it. The two that really piqued my interest is of course, the Senate part and the appointing of judges. I despise the Senate, hate them. Well, I won't say hate. That's a strong word. We love everyone, but I'm pretty sure it's based off of the United Kingdom's House of Lords, which is also appointed. I think it really just, we have such a good thing going for our democracy with a multi-party system, and it just gets ruined by the Senate. I really wish we would take a more Americanized approach where their Senate has an equal amount of representation from every single state. I think that's such a smart setup on the Americans' part, to have one part of your house to be based off population and the other to be based off land. It makes it more fair. But when you appoint these senators, it's based off whoever is in power. And for the last decade, it's been the Liberals. So we're going to have a naturally more liberal Senate, which, shocker, is not fair to all the provinces that aren't liberal. And so that representation is not there. And I think you mentioned, Katie, that the Trudeau appointed Albertan senators that don't represent Alberta. He appointed senators from the most liberal places in Alberta. So that doesn't represent Alberta in the slightest when you're handpicking your senators from certain places. And that just doesn't work. And I am a huge supporter of changing how our Senate works to be more representative of the country. On the judge side, though, I am a little bit concerned, because when Danielle first came out with this idea of having more control over the judge appointment process, it sounded more like she just wanted to have more input. But the way this referendum question is worded seems to be, let me read it again. Have the provincial governments and not the federal government select justice appointed to the provincial King's Bench and appeal courts. So it sounds more like the provinces should have complete control over the appointment of judges, which concerns me, because I don't even think the federal government should have complete control over it, nor do I think the provincial government should have complete control. I think there needs to be cooperation between the two parts of government, so there isn't any one-sided. Because if we had complete control, if Danielle had complete control, I'm not saying she's like corrupt or anything, but she would probably lean towards more conservative judges that would rule more in her favor. And Carney and Justin Trudeau would lean towards more liberal judges, which would rule more in their favor. So either way, it's a losing situation. So I think having complete control on either side is a bad idea, but there should be some more co-op.
Maybe a good good middle point or like compromise would be having more of like an independent process, right? So just to ensure that like the people that are filling like these key roles are, they're not motivated by like their own like personal biases, that they are making judgments based off like the letter of the law, right? And not their own biases. So I agree, like there could be reforms, to the Senate and judiciary for sure. And like it shouldn't be done in a way where like one side is like one level of government's favored over another.
Yeah, and I do think that it is kind of difficult when you get into an area of partisanship playing a role in the justice system, because really, judges and the justice system, there's no place for partisanship or even politics really in justice. Obviously, it's a part of the government, and that makes sense because that's how it's managed. But I think that there shouldn't be a fear that judges will be making judiciary decisions based on what will please the government. They should, and I know it's an idealized dream, but judges should be making choices based on what is just and on what is right or what is in accordance with the law. There shouldn't be fear for partisanship in either. And there's risk, as kind of you were saying, Evan, there's risk either way of that happening. So I do think that probably a system of collaboration and input that would be what is best. And I think definitely like that's what I think that's what Daniel Smith and that's what the government is trying to advocate for right now is input and collaboration, the ability to collaborate more in the decisions that the federal government is making that affects them. Because also if you look on the matter of immigration, we have talked a lot in both of these episodes that we've made so far about the effect that the federal immigration policies have had on us as the province of Alberta. So I think, an ability to kind of have more input and say and control over that would be very beneficial for the province. But the one thought that I had is, how likely do you guys think it is that of other provinces collaborating with us to have any of these constitutional amendments happen? Do you think that that's a possibility? Do you think this is something that the other provinces are going to cooperate with, or what's kind of your perspective on that?
Well, that's something I highlighted as a challenge because of course, like, there's different governments in different provinces, so like they might have their own qualms with uh, with like the proposal that's being made by Alberta, right? They may think it's like kind of self-serving from our perspective, so they might have issues with that. I do think all provinces could agree with like having more of an independent process. I think that's something that could gain consensus as long as that's kind of like the leading point that Alberta goes by. There is a possibility that we could have some constitutional reforms around like the judiciary and the Senate too.
I think from a more realist point of view, the idea of abolishing the Senate it's not going to happen. I doubt Ontario or Quebec. I'm pretty sure Ontario, Quebec hold most of the Senate's power, and I doubt they're willing to relinquish that control that they have over the rest of Canada. When it comes to the judges, I don't know. I'd be curious to see if the other provinces are interested in having more control over their more judicial side of government. Do the territories count as towards the amending the constitution? Like it says 7 provinces. Do those
No,
include the territories?
that's a great question. I'm not too sure on that one, but yeah, possibly. I mean, but I think if it says provinces, it's probably just the provinces, right?
Yeah. So 7
Yeah,
provinces is a lot. And
yeah, yeah.
I don't even know if the Maritimes can make decisions for their own.
And I
Have you
mean,
ever
I think, sorry, go ahead.
I'm just thinking I've never has anyone heard from the Maritimes recently? Are they still alive?
Yeah, if they are alive, it's because Ottawa's keeping them alive. So, and I mean, and is it even possible to have 50% of the Canadian population if Quebec or Ontario isn't included in that? Like, I don't think it is. I don't think that's mathematically possible. But yeah,
Right,
I
right.
guess something that I always think of is like here in Alberta, I feel like we're in such an echo chamber of we're Albertan and we know what Alberta needs and we know what Alberta wants and we know the merits of the things that the government's proposing and things too, but we don't realize necessarily that when you go out into the other provinces, they just have no idea. They don't care. They don't know what's happening here. They don't know the finer points of what Daniel Smith is proposing or the benefits of this autonomy. They just really they don't know what's happening in Alberta. I was talking to one of my friends who lives in Vancouver, and I said something about separatism, about how it's like gaining traction here. She's like, "That's real?" She was like, "I thought that was just a joke. I thought that was a meme." And I was like, "No, that's what's happening." And they don't. I think that that's pretty consistent. Like if you talk to people from even like out in Ontario or Quebec that aren't super invested in politics, they don't know what's happening in Alberta, and they don't really care. And so I think that if it would ever be to a matter of getting public support, I mean, I think it's possible. Maybe, maybe the other provinces, the people would be interested in what these amendments mean, but I also think they don't necessarily know what's happening and it's not on their minds, even though it is on ours and it's very
You
important to
know,
us.
another thing to consider with like the Senate actually that just came across my mind that when Evan mentioned like the American system where, senators are elected, you could say one thing about the Canadian system is that, the senators are not elected, they're appointed, right? So they can't really don't have much say in stalling like the legislative agenda that the government's proposing. and that's why they're kind of known as like the sober second thought, right? Because a lot of their role is like relegated to just examining legislation in detail and proposing like reasonable and sound changes that I guess like that could get approval, like bipartisan approval, right? From both from or not bipartisan, but like from all political parties in the system, right? So I mean, one thing to consider is that like if we did have kind of like a more American style, it could contribute to more gridlock legislatively, and that could present a challenge in a time where I think we do need like a federal government that takes decisive action, right? So that's just one kind of drawback that I had to.
I do believe that the gridlock was intentional by the founding fathers. I could be wrong, correct me, but I believe the gridlock and the slowness of the legislation was
Yes, yes,
purposeful to prevent,
yes. That's why I think it was like more of an appointment thing, right? Like it's like they appoint senators based off of, I guess like their backgrounds and everything, or their credentials and their backgrounds. It's not. It's more, yeah. It's supposed to serve as like a sober second thought. That's kind of what it's known as in like a lot of like Canadian textbooks. If you see it, I mean, if you learn about the Senate, in your like in classes on that cover like civic education, then yeah, you'll probably hear that the Senate is supposed to be like a second sober thought type of thing, right? It's gridlock is intentional. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that, idealistically, like if that was true, that would be really great. But unfortunately, I think that we just are so partisan in our culture, in our political culture now, that the appointment by the prime ministers just means that they're necessarily liberal people because we have a currently liberal federal government.
I th
I don't think it means that they're necessarily bipartisan. But I guess the thing I do remember learning when I was in social class was that the Senate does just end up approving most things. Like they don't usually
yeah,
find
that's
problems with
it's
things.
not that much gridlock. Yeah.
But for me, that just kind of makes me think, why are we paying for it then? Because I'm pretty sure the constitutional amendment is abolishing the Senate, right? It's not reforming it. And because it's like, well, if they're not even contributing, like if they're not even changing things, if they're just approving things in the way that they are, then why are we funding this in the first place? I don't know if there's necessarily a necessity for the Senate in Canada. Evan?
And that's a great point. I mean, like I mean the role that they have is supposed to be. I think I accidentally said that like the gridlock is like yeah, I think the system is supposed to kind of prevent like the parliamentary system in general is kind of designed in a way where it's kind of supposed to be opposite of the American system. And I feel like the American system does have more gridlock, and that could be very beneficial because in that gridlock, a lot of valuable changes do emerge out of that gridlock, right? And so, I mean, with the Senate in Canada, I mean, like technically, you're right. I feel like a lot of changes that could be made, a lot of them are made in the committee stage already, right? So it could just be redundant, right?
I'd just like to mention some data David gave to us, who's not visible, but he's here in spirit.
Our
It's
producer sent us data.
so yeah. There's currently 100 senators appointed by Trudeau and Mark Carney, 3 senators by Stephen Harper, and 2 senators by I'm not going to say that. That's too French.
Jean
Different
Chrétien?
liberal.
Jean
Different liberal.
Chrétien?
Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah, that's so. There's only 3 people in the Senate that represents conservative viewpoints, and like it or not, if you think that it's meant to be unbiased, everyone has that bias, and when someone gives you a job, if someone gave me a job, I'd be more likely to favor them as well. Does that make it right? No, but it's just human nature, and it's 100 is ridiculous. It should be more even.
Apparently, Justin Trudeau even like when he came to power, I think he reformed the process of like choosing senators. Now I believe there's like an independent like body that chooses the senators. But there's still like kind of the question of if that's kind of just like an illusion of like nonpartisanship. It might and there are a lot of articles that have been published like in the media where like there has been criticism of that process. It's not about like choosing people based on their merit, right? There is partisanship involved, right? There's a lot of articles. I believe I can't find it at the moment right now, but if you do like Google search, you'll find articles that criticize that process. So maybe doing away with the Senate is probably like the best thing, right?
Yeah, I think we need to come back to the question, which is abolish it, from
Yeah.
our point of view, although it could be a great second opinion, I think how it is weighted towards liberals, it's not really a second opinion. It's just another meaningless process to approve legislation. So it's a waste of taxpayer dollars in the state that it is right now. I had something to say like 20 minutes ago, and I don't even know what it was.
I know. I was thinking I'd start taking notes while everybody else is talking and keep on track. But one thing I think maybe we'll have one last comment on the referendum questions, and then we'll wrap it up for today. But an interesting thing that I noticed in one of the articles that I was reading, it said that Danielle Smith's push for further control over immigration to Alberta will add more bureaucracy to the immigration process and won't actually benefit the province. Do you guys have any comments on that? Do you think that further control by the province on immigration will add more bureaucracy, or do you think that it will be beneficial broadly?
Okay. I would like to know how they expect to implement this control. Are we going to start setting up borders? And like I've said before, that's very unconstitutional, against our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So I understand where the article is coming from. How are we supposed to implement this control? Because I doubt Ontario or Quebec or any of these other provinces are going to loosen up on their controls. If we're the only province tightening our controls, congratulations, we still have borders that are open because our constitution requires our borders with other provinces to be open. So people can still come here if they come through BC or Saskatchewan.
I think well, Quebec does have its own process for bringing in immigrants, and they have utilized that process to bring in immigrants that are more kind of aligned with the Quebec culture, right? That are like French speaking. I believe they bring a lot of people from like Haiti and Senegal, which are like predominantly French, or yeah, they're French speaking countries. So I do think it could work. I just like again a lot of it comes down to details. So I mean I can't say much about like how it would look like because like we don't have those details at hand right now, but it could be possible, right? Like we could have our own system and make it work.
Okay, great. Do you guys have any last comments on any of the referendum topics that we discussed today?
I did just want to make not like a statement on what we talked about, but a statement broad of what we represent, because I just want to say, like, just because we're critical at times with our government does not mean that we completely endorse them. That's what I wanted to say. It's not like we're no UCP bad. We criticize them because we are them, right? You have your thoughts about your parents. We all have our thoughts about our parents. So that's kind of the situation. We criticize because we love them, not because we actually think it's a problem.
And it is for sure. And it's great that we live in a place where we're able to have frank discussions about our governments too, and just be able to express our thoughts on these topics without worrying that we have to, feel one way or another about things. But yeah, I think that's a wrap for today. Huge thanks to Evan and Raghu for helping us make sense of the new provincial budget and the referendum questions. If you found this conversation helpful, please make sure to like this video and share the link with your friends. It really helps our youth group get these important topics out there. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.